She walked into my courtroom smiling, 17 years old, charged with killing someone, and she laughed. She smiled at me. This 17-year-old girl just killed someone with her car, and she's sitting there grinning. Haley Cruz thought this was a joke. The victim's family sat right behind her, crying, broken. She didn't even look at them. I stared at her. She leaned over to her lawyer and whispered, "I'll be home by the weekend." The microphone caught every word. The victim's mother heard it. I heard it. She thought the rules didn't apply to her, but there was one piece of evidence she forgot about. Her own phone still recording, capturing everything. And what I did next left everyone in that courtroom speechless. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. 6 months earlier, on a quiet spring evening in Clearwater Heights, 17-year-old Lucas Rivera walked out of the community center with his backpack hanging off one shoulder. Inside were college brochures, homework he'd finish later, and a permission slip for a summer engineering camp his parents had finally agreed to let him attend. Lucas had walked this route home 1,000 times, down Maple Avenue, past the corner store, across the intersection at Ridgeway and Elm. Tonight, he pulled out his phone and texted his mom, "Leaving now. Be home in 10. Don't start the movie without me." He hit send, slipped the phone into his pocket, and kept walking. He had no idea that 3 blocks away, someone was about to make a choice that would end his life. Lucas Rivera wasn't supposed to be a headline. He was just a kid trying to get through his junior year with decent grades and maybe a scholarship to study engineering. His teachers described him as quiet but curious. His friends knew him as the guy who always had gum, who'd let you copy his notes if you were sick, who never made a big deal out of helping anyone. He was the older brother who taught his little sister Marisol how to solve algebra problems and promised to buy her a new sketchbook with his next paycheck. He wasn't perfect, but he was loved. At the intersection of Ridgeway and Elm, Lucas waited for the pedestrian signal. When it turned white, he glanced left, then right, the way his parents had taught him since he was little. He stepped off the curb and into the crosswalk. He had the right of way. He was doing everything correctly. But 3 blocks down Ridgeway, something else was happening. A dark sports car with tinted windows was accelerating, the engine growling louder as it picked up speed. Inside, music blasted from the speakers. The driver, 17-year-old Haley Cruz, held her phone up in one hand, recording herself as she drove. In the passenger seat, her friend laughed and shouted something encouraging. Haley grinned, the kind of grin that came from adrenaline and the thrill of doing something she wasn't supposed to do. She pressed her foot down on the gas. The speedometer climbed 45, 50, 60. The light ahead turned yellow, then red. She didn't slow down. She didn't even hesitate. She kept going, her voice bright and careless into the camera. Speed limits are such a joke at night. Lucas made it halfway across before he heard it. The roar of an engine, too close, too loud, growing impossibly fast. He turned his head, eyes widening, just a split second of pure blinding terror, and then impact. The sound was sickening. Lucas's body was thrown onto the hood, then onto the pavement. His backpack skidded across the asphalt, notebooks and papers scattered like fallen leaves. The car's tires screeched as the driver finally hit the brakes. Too late, far too late, rolling to a stop 20 feet past the crosswalk. For a moment, the world went silent. Then the screaming started. Inside the car, the passenger Sierra was sobbing, hands pressed against her face, repeating, "Oh my God, we hit him, we hit him." Haley sat gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Her first words weren't a cry for help. They were sharp, defensive, almost annoyed. Why was he in the road like that? He walked right out. She didn't run to check on Lucas. Instead, she reached for her phone, still mounted on the dashboard, checking to see if the video had kept recording. In all my years on television, I have seen defendants who lied, defendants who cried crocodile tears, defendants who put on every kind of act imaginable. But when I heard those first words out of Haley Cruz's mouth, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The first patrol officer dropped to his knees beside Lucas, pressing 2 fingers to the boy's neck. His face tightened. He reached for his radio. "We need paramedics now. Pedestrian strike. Severe head trauma. Unresponsive." Around Lucas's head, a dark pool was spreading across the asphalt, soaking into his backpack strap, creeping toward the scattered pages of his homework. One page, a math worksheet with his name written neatly at the top. fluttered slightly in the breeze. Such a small, ordinary detail, and it made everything so much worse. The second officer approached Haley, who stood beside her car looking uncomfortable, like someone stuck in a long line at the store. She immediately started talking. "He just came out of nowhere. It's not my fault." The officer leaned closer and caught it, that faint chemical smell on her breath. "Have you been drinking tonight?" Haley hesitated. "Like one drink, hours ago. I'm fine." She wasn't fine. The officer made a note in his notebook, underlining it twice. Witnesses crowded around, all talking at once. She was speeding. She ran the red light. She had her phone up. She was filming herself. The anger in their voices was palpable. They had watched a kid get thrown into the air like a broken toy and seen the driver react like it was an inconvenience. At 8:39 that evening, the paramedics looked at each other, and one slowly shook his head. Lucas Rivera, 17 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. 3 blocks away, Lucas's mother checked her phone for the 5th time. She called him. Voicemail. Called again. Voicemail. She was in the middle of worrying when there was a knock at the door, a firm, measured knock, the kind that doesn't sound like a neighbor stopping by. Everyone in the room froze. David opened the door to 2 uniformed police officers standing on his porch, hats in their hands, faces carefully neutral. They sat in the living room, the same room where Lucas had sprawled on the couch just hours ago, and spoke in low, careful tones, words like accident and intersection and unresponsive. Lucas's mother shook her head. "No, that's not right. He's careful. He always looks both ways." "I'm so sorry. His injuries were too severe." The words "too severe" finally broke through. She made a sound that came from somewhere deep and primal, a place where language didn't exist. Marisol sat frozen on the couch. She didn't cry. She just stared, her mind refusing to process what they were saying. Lucas couldn't be dead. The last time she'd seen him, she hadn't even said goodbye. She'd just been scrolling through her tablet, barely looking up as he left. And now he was gone. The movie they'd been waiting to watch was still paused on the screen, frozen on the same frame it had been when Lucas texted that he'd be home in 10 minutes. No one had the heart to turn it off. Subscribe, because what happened next is where this story gets real. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the crash had become an active criminal investigation. Detective Malloy arrived at the station just after 6 and found a thick file waiting on her desk. She scanned the reports. Male victim, 17, deceased. Female driver, also 17, arrested for DUI and vehicular manslaughter. Multiple witnesses. Video evidence. That last detail made her pause. 2 phones had been recovered. One belonged to Lucas, screen shattered but potentially salvageable. The other belonged to Haley, still mounted to the dashboard, its screen frozen on a paused video. 2 days later, Malloy sat in the digital forensics lab and watched a technician pull up the file. Most recent video, recorded at 8:14 p.m. the night in question. Duration, 43 seconds. Never uploaded. "Play it," Malloy said. What unfolded in the next 43 seconds would become the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. The video opened with Haley's face, lit by the dashboard glow, grinning at the camera, music blasted in the background. "Late night Ridgeway run with my baby. Watch this." The speedometer was visible in the windshield reflection. 45 miles per hour, then 50, higher. The passenger shouted, "Hit 70, come on!" Haley laughed. "These speed limits are such a joke at night. There's literally no one out." The speedometer climbed past 60. The road ahead became partially visible. A traffic light glowed yellow, then red. Instead of slowing, Haley's voice cut through again. "We're making this one." The passenger's excited squeal turned to a panicked gasp. A shape appeared in the crosswalk. "Haley," she never finished. A violent jolt. The phone whipped sideways and spun as it fell from its mount. The last clear sound was a sickening thump. Then Sierra's choked sob. "We hit him, we hit him." The video cut to black, but the video wasn't the only evidence. Forensics dug deeper into Haley's social media accounts and found a disturbing pattern. This wasn't her first reckless driving video, not even close. Dozens of clips, weaving through residential streets at 50 in a 25 zone, blowing through a school zone while laughing at a crossing guard, racing another car at nearly 90 miles per hour on a highway at night. The captions, "Too fast for this boring town," "Rules are for people who can't drive," "Speed demons only." Scattered among the encouraging fire emojis were warnings from former friends. "Haley, seriously, you're going to hurt someone. This isn't cool anymore." Her response, a string of eye-roll emojis and "chill out, mom." The toxicology results confirmed blood alcohol content of 0.06%, under the adult limit, but for a minor, any detectable alcohol while driving was a violation. Further down the page, THC metabolites detected, consistent with marijuana use within the past several hours. The combination significantly impairs reaction time and judgment, especially in inexperienced drivers. Haley had claimed she'd had one drink hours ago and was totally fine. The science said otherwise. The most heartbreaking piece of evidence came from Lucas's phone. Forensics recovered data from its internal memory, his final text messages, his last app usage. At 8:13 p.m., Lucas had opened his messaging app and started typing to his mother. The message was never sent, interrupted by the crash that killed him. The recovered draft read, "Crossing now. See you in a sec." Malloy stared at those words for a long time. He had been doing exactly what he was supposed to do. He had been careful. He had been in the right place at the right time, following the rules. And it hadn't mattered, because someone else had decided the rules didn't apply to them. Malloy compiled everything and delivered it personally to the prosecutor's office. "Read it all, then tell me this girl deserves to be tried as a juvenile." Prosecutor Karen Chen opened the folder and began to read. 20 minutes later, she looked up, her expression grim. "We're filing a motion to transfer to adult court today." The motion was granted. Haley Cruz would be tried as an adult on all charges. To understand why Haley sat in my courtroom smirking, why she whispered about going home by the weekend, you have to understand what she'd learned about consequences long before she ever got behind the wheel. Haley grew up in Clearwater Heights, in one of the newer developments on the east side, where houses had 3-car garages and gated entrances. Her parents divorced when she was 12, and both of them, guilty and exhausted, had learned to cope with her demands by giving in. Haley, smart and observant, learned quickly that the right combination of charm and manipulation could get her almost anything she wanted. Her school records painted a picture of a student who was intelligent but lazy, charming when she wanted something, dismissive when she didn't. One teacher, braver than the others, wrote in a private note later unsealed, "Haley has learned to weaponize her charm. She is capable of genuine kindness, but only when it serves her interests." The car, the black sports coupe, had been a 17th birthday gift from her father. Expensive, flashy, more car than any teenager needed. Within weeks, she'd racked up 2 speeding tickets, both paid by her father, both disappeared from her record after he hired a traffic attorney. She bragged about it to friends. "It's so easy to get out of tickets if you know the right people." Once again, the system bent around her. Once again, she walked away believing consequences were something that happened to other, less fortunate people. One former friend named Emily gave a statement to investigators. "She scared me, not because she was a bad person, but because she genuinely didn't seem to understand that other people were real. She'd be going 70 in a neighborhood, and I'd beg her to slow down, and she'd just laugh. She thought she was invincible." These stories formed a portrait of someone who had never been forced to truly reckon with her actions. Until now. The trial date arrived. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled an hour before the scheduled start. People lined the back wall. News cameras clustered outside. Everyone wanted to see if the smirking teenager from the videos would finally face real consequences. The Rivera family arrived together, dressed in black. Maria carried Lucas's school photo and positioned it on the bench beside her, where everyone could see it, where Haley would have to see it if she turned around. When I entered, the room fell silent. Haley was escorted in wearing a dark blue dress her lawyer had carefully selected to make her look young and sympathetic. For a moment she looked small, almost childlike. But then she glanced toward the gallery, caught sight of someone in the crowd, and her lips curved upward in the faintest smirk before she caught herself and smoothed her expression back to neutral. I noticed. I notice everything. Prosecutor Karen Chen delivered her opening statement. On a spring evening 6 months ago, a 17-year-old boy named Lucas Rivera left the community center where he had been tutoring younger students. He texted his mother to let her know he'd be home in 10 minutes. When he reached the intersection at Ridgeway and Elm, he waited for the pedestrian signal. When it turned white, when the law told him it was safe, he stepped into the crosswalk. He never made it to the other side. She turned slightly toward Haley. At the same moment, the defendant was driving down Ridgeway at nearly 70 miles an hour in a 35 miles per hour zone. She had alcohol in her system. She had THC in her system. And she was recording a video on her phone to post on social media. She told her passenger, "Speed limits are such a joke at night. When the light turned red, she said, 'We're making this one.' And she accelerated, ran that red light, and struck Lucas Rivera in the middle of the crosswalk where he had every legal right to be. The impact threw him onto her windshield and then onto the pavement where he died from severe head trauma. She walked closer to the jury box. This isn't a tragedy. This is vehicular homicide. And at the end of this trial, after you've heard all the evidence and seen all the videos, I'm going to ask you to hold the defendant accountable for the choices she made and the life she took." Defense attorney Robert Hastings stood next, his voice gentle. "Everything the prosecution just told you about that night is true. A young man died. A family lost their son. That is a tragedy that no verdict can ever undo. But here's what else is true. Haley Cruz is 17 years old. Her brain won't be fully developed for several more years. The part that controls impulse, that weighs consequences, that part isn't finished growing yet. That's not an excuse. It's biology." He looked at the jury. "The prosecution wants you to see a pattern of reckless behavior, but what I see is a teenager caught up in social media culture, trying to fit in, making the same kinds of risky choices that a lot of teenagers make. Most of the time, those choices don't end in tragedy. This time, horribly, they did. I'm asking you to remember that people, especially young people, can change." I've heard a lot of lawyers. I understood exactly what Hastings was doing. He wasn't wrong about brain development, but there's a difference between a kid who makes a mistake and a kid who documents her contempt for human safety for months, laughs about it on camera, then smirks in my courtroom. That's not a mistake. That's a character. The prosecution built their case piece by piece. The first officer on scene testified about finding Lucas in the crosswalk and about Haley's first words, "Why was he in the road like that?" noting she showed more concern for justifying what happened than for the victim. The medical examiner confirmed that at 35 miles per hour, Lucas would most likely have survived. At 70 miles per hour, survival was nearly impossible. The toxicology expert confirmed the alcohol and THC and their combined effect on reaction time and judgment. And then came the video. The lights dimmed. The monitor flickered to life. There was Haley's face, grinning at the camera, music blasting, young and carefree and utterly oblivious. "Late night Ridgeway run with my baby. Watch this." The jury watched in silence as the speedometer climbed, as Haley laughed about speed limits, as the red light appeared and she said, "We're making this one," as the shape of a person appeared in the crosswalk, as the video jerked, spun, and cut to chaos and that horrible, sickening thump. Several jurors were visibly shaken. One woman in the back row was crying silently. I played it twice more. The defense objected each time. I overruled each time. The prosecution then played a compilation of Haley's previous videos, months of escalating recklessness, weaving through residential streets at 50 in a 25 zone, blowing through a school zone, racing at 90 miles per hour on a highway at night, the captions scrolling by, the warnings from friends she dismissed with eye-roll emojis. By the time the montage ended, the defense's narrative of a good kid who made one bad choice was in tatters. The eyewitnesses followed, each one telling the same story: a car going far too fast, distracted, ignoring signals, and a victim who had done everything right. When the prosecution rested, the weight of the evidence felt almost physical. The defense's case was exactly what you'd expect. Character witnesses who knew a different Haley, a neighbor who said she once helped bring in groceries, a teacher who described her volunteering at a food drive, a youth pastor who spoke about redemption and second chances. Genuine testimony, and every single witness had to admit under cross-examination that they hadn't known about the speeding, the videos, the tickets, that they'd only known the version of Haley she chose to show them. The psychological expert testified about brain development and social media pressure. The prosecutor had one response. In the actual seconds before she killed Lucas Rivera, her passenger was screaming her name in fear. So where was the peer pressure in that specific moment? A long pause. She was making her own choices. Yes. Haley's mother, Sandra Cruz, took the stand, a broken woman, aged by months of stress, and wept about loving her daughter and not wanting her to lose her entire future. The prosecutor, gently but firmly, asked, "Did you know about the drinking, the marijuana, the speeding tickets your ex-husband paid to make disappear?" "No, no, no." "Mrs. Cruz, while you waited for her to grow out of it, she got behind the wheel, intoxicated and distracted, and killed someone's son." The defense rested. In the end, they kept Haley off the stand. The risks were too high. She could say the words of remorse, but she couldn't feel them. And a jury would see through it in seconds. Closing arguments. Chen stood one final time. "You've watched a video of the defendant laughing about breaking the law seconds before she killed someone. You've heard her own words. Speed limits are such a joke. You've seen months of reckless behavior. You've heard from the medical examiner that Lucas Rivera would be alive today if she had been driving the speed limit. The defense wants you to think about the defendant's future, but I'm asking you to think about Lucas's future, the one he'll never have, the engineering degree he'll never earn, the bridges he'll never build, the family he'll never raise." She looked at each juror in turn. Lucas Rivera did everything right that night. He waited for the signal. He crossed in the crosswalk. He trusted that drivers would follow the law, and that trust cost him his life. This isn't a tragedy. This is vehicular homicide, and there is only one possible verdict: guilty on all counts. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. When the verdict came in, everyone scrambled back to the courtroom. The Rivera family took their positions in the front row, Maria clutching Lucas's photo so tightly her knuckles were white. Haley was brought in. For the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely scared. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembled. The clerk began to read. "In the matter of the state versus Haley Cruz, on the charge of aggravated vehicular homicide, we, the jury, find the defendant." A pause. "Guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Haley's knees buckled. Lucas's mother let out a choked sob. "On the charge of driving under the influence causing death, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty, 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 guilty." 3 times the word Haley had convinced herself she'd never hear. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists. This time there was no smirk, no whispered confidence about going home, just tears streaming down her face as the weight of consequences she'd avoided her entire life came crashing down all at once. "Subscribe, because sentencing day is coming," and what I said to her, you will not forget. Sentencing day arrived. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been during the trial. Every seat filled, people lining the back wall, news cameras clustered at the entrance. The Rivera family took their familiar spots in the front row. Lucas's photo positioned where everyone could see it. Maria wore all black, her face composed but her eyes hollow. David sat ramrod straight, jaw clenched. Marisol, now 15, sat between them, looking smaller than she had months ago, as if grief had physically diminished her. I entered, settled into my seat, and surveyed the packed courtroom. "Please be seated." Haley was brought in wearing a simple gray dress her mother had brought, pale and drawn, looking young, vulnerable, nothing like the grinning girl from the videos, but I had seen those videos, and I knew that appearances can be carefully constructed. Actions tell the truth. I opened with the victim impact statements. Maria Rivera approached the podium first, her legs unsteady. She sat down her papers with trembling hands, looked up at me, then turned slightly so she could see both me and Haley. "Your Honor, my name is Maria Rivera. I am the mother of Lucas Alexander Rivera." She paused, steadying herself. Lucas was 17 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He wanted to be an engineer, to build bridges, to create things that would help people. He was accepted to 2 universities with scholarship offers. He tutored younger kids in math, not for money or college applications, but because he liked helping people. He was kind, he was careful, he was responsible, everything a parent hopes their child will be. She looked directly at Haley, who stared at the table, refusing to meet her eyes. "The night he died, he texted me. He said he'd be home in 10 minutes. I waited for him. I stood at that window and I waited. When the police came to my door instead of my son, they told me there had been an accident, but it wasn't an accident. Accidents are unavoidable. What happened to Lucas was the result of deliberate choices made by the defendant. She chose to drink. She chose to drive. She chose to speed. She chose to film herself. She chose to run a red light at 70 miles an hour, knowing full well what she was doing. Maria's hands gripped the edges of the podium. And then, after she killed him, she complained that he shouldn't have been in the road. She showed no remorse. She smirked in court. She told her lawyer she'd be home by the weekend, as if my son's life meant nothing. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice didn't waver. I will never see my son graduate. I will never watch him walk across